Welcome everyone to Vetsquared Innovet Influencer Podcasts. And I'd like to straight off the bat welcome Dr. Leanne Wall.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you so much, Leanne. This series is really about self and leadership skill for veterinary professionals. It's about some basics in business, but a really important piece is emotional fitness. Now, when I met you several years ago in Melbourne at the Coaching Institute, we resonated because of our accents and also because we come basically from caregiving industries. And it really struck me that we're both now doing work in this wellness space and how that came about. So I know this is one of your passions, and if you can perhaps just give us an idea of how a doctor ends up doing this kind of work.
Perfect. Thank you, Larry. And thanks again for the opportunity. I know you and I have been planning this for a while now, and life kind of gets in the way. And often, that's a learning in itself, isn't it? If we prioritize others, and particularly being in caretaking industries or sectors like we are, generally patients, or your patients as in pets and their owners, and patients in my sense and their families, always seem to, when we triage, come out at the top. And, from my personal experience, our well-being or focus on ourselves goes to the bottom. And I do a lot of work in the healthcare space. I work with a lot of nurses, particularly through COVID. And I think it's put so much pressure in the system. And something to be mindful of, and I think that's why we so resonated, was being in carer professions, we put everybody first. And the analogy of the oxygen mask, when you get in the plane and, worst case scenario, it comes down, the instruction is always put it on yourself before others. And, in my lived experience and experience working with people in healthcare sector, it's kind of help everybody else in the plane metaphorically. And then when we totally ischemic and anoxic, then it's kind of, forgot about us. And, that's how I found myself in burnout. And, from the story you share, you did as well.
So if I said to you, empathy without boundaries leads to self-destruction, would that be a bit dramatic, or is that, how do you learn these boundaries? Is it the responsibility of the organization? Is it your personal responsibility?
Yeah, I think that's a twofold question. So the first part is, I don't think it's an overstatement, is empathy without boundaries. In my view, empathy without boundaries is going to ultimately land up in burnout. I mean, physiologically, if you look at how we are wired physiologically, we were never ever meant to, back in cave days, we were never ever meant to have our stress response switched on 24/7. If there was a physical crisis, we would have it go out of equilibrium or homeostasis. We'd, upregulate everything that needed us to fight or run. And then when, that crisis was over, we'd go back into equilibrium, renew the energy tanks, and get all the other functions in the body back into equilibrium. And what's happened, just if you look over the last 2-3 years, and I've done a huge amount of work over the last 2-3 years in people, with people and teams that are absolutely burnt out and exhausted, is, having that disequilibrium or out of homeostasis long term. And, there's only so much energy that we can use until we get to a state where our energy tanks are empty. And if we're not replenishing them on a regular basis and proactively and deliberately focusing on our own mental and emotional and physical fitness, then it's not a matter of whether, and you might last longer than maybe others. And some of you listening to this might think, I've got it, I'll be fine. But if you just look at the physiology of it, it's ultimately you're going to land up in burnout. It might take you longer and some people shorter. So to the responsibility, and again, it depends, I mean, I know that a lot of vets are in practice and they have their own business. So they are the organization in that context. So, does the organization need to look after their people. So as vets, the people that work with them, the assistants, everything else. And, that's totally your area of expertise. But if I put it in the healthcare sector where doctors are running practices, yes, they do need to provide. If you just look at our occupational health and safety in Australia, they now have legislation that is not only physical safety, but also mental safety. And so if you're running a practice, as an example, whether it's a vet or a doctor, you have to create those OH&S kind of spaces for your staff to get some, mental fitness training, to make sure you're checking in on them and looking after them and providing an environment that's conducive to, reducing all that psychological stress that sometimes can come out of poor leadership, running a practice without really connecting with your staff. I've got a family member who's a vet, and she's fairly young in her tenure. I mean, she's late, just turned 30, so she's past the grad, but worked in a practice that was so toxic from how it was run, the leadership in that practice, that it basically inevitably she left with a number of other colleagues because the environment was so stressful. Not to even mention what you're doing clinically. That's already stressful, what you're doing. But if you overlay the leadership in the practice and how, that power differential, and if there isn't an opportunity to feel safe, that you can put up your hand and go, I need help, I'm struggling, then it's even more difficult. So definitely organizational wise, we have a responsibility. If we are a practice owner or work within an organization, the organization has a responsibility. Having said that, it's definitely also individual responsibility, because it's up to us to make a deliberate decision as to whether we are going to ensure we are mentally, emotionally, and physically fit. And with all the work that I do, and I do a lot of work in this space, mental health, wellness, and most of the time it's that people neglect themselves. And it's interesting in the caretaker, what I'm finding is there's a lot of guilt. I don't know if you notice this in vet, like a lot of the nurses, as an example, go, I feel guilty. Spend 10 minutes away from my desk, having lunch in the garden outside the hospital, because what about all the patients that need me? So I'd be interested to know from your perspective is whether that guilt topic comes up. I feel guilty looking after myself, but the irony is if we don't look after ourselves, how can we ever be any use to the people around us, whether it's professionally or personally? I'd be keen to get your sense of this guilt thing. Do you get that as a theme in vet?
I think if I say empathy without boundaries leads to self-destruction, I'd also say financial destruction, because a lot of it is around the perception that there's a personal responsibility for positive outcomes. There's a personal responsibility to keep the bill low. So there's a lot of factors in there, which makes it really difficult emotionally and economically for the business owner. So I'm really glad that you say it comes from both sides. I was fascinated when I first spoke to you about the different colors of the energy level, and for another topic, but going into environments where you don't really want to express openly how you feel, but when you walk into the environment, you're either already red and triggered, you're kind of slightly orange, or you're green. How do you suggest that people check in with themselves before they show up in the organization, so that part of it's the organization's responsibility, but part of it's also yours? And I think if I think back as a young veterinarian, besides the professional pressures on you and imposter syndrome and feeling like you're not good enough, there's the pressure from the public that are demanding. There's your private life. So there's a lot of factors that determine whether you're showing up as your best self in a really stressful environment.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it would be worth, we've talked about the performance stress curve. Would it be worth, if you want me to just share that diagram you and I have talked about,
Absolutely.
and walk,
Yes.
the listeners through, who are watching this, because I find this incredibly powerful if we have a sense of, and there are always two questions when it comes to self-care and the workshops that I run. The first one is awareness of how am I and where am I?
Yeah.
Because if every flag that our body is sending us going, hey, you better pay attention, I'm really fatigued, or I'm emotionally foggy because I'm offline because my stress is too high. And what we tend to do is we kind of, especially the high achievers amongst us, or when we've got a lot of workload, and let's face it, in the professions we are, there's probably a good deal of high achievers. We always tend to, initially, when those early flags come up, we squash them down. I'll be fine. On the weekend, I'll sleep the whole of Saturday. And so what happens is the awareness of how we are physiologically switched on, how we are energy fatiguing, we tend to ignore until it's so bad, which is what I did. That's my personal journey until I had my full-on burnout. And that took 6 months to recover. So first of all, it's awareness of how am I and where am I? And then the other component of it is the deliberate proactive recovery strategies, not on a monthly when I go on holiday, not on a Saturday after a hideous week and then I sleep all day because I'm exhausted, but on a daily basis, the small little things you can do to top your energy tank up. And this is a performance stress curve that it's sourced from Yerkes and Dodson back over 100 years ago. What they found was that we need a certain amount of stress in the system to be able to perform as humans. And it's quite interesting, this drone zone is when there's minimal stress in the system, we actually can't perform at our optimal best. And, you talk to people who go, I want a job where there's no stress. Well, first of all, I don't think they exist. Second of all, well, if they did exist, you wouldn't really perform at your optimum. You'd get to the drone zone. I don't know if you remember, like back in vet school and medical school, we used to finish university and have like 3-4 months off. Did you have big chunks of time?
Those long holidays.
Exactly. And kind of by 2 to 3 months, I'm going, okay, like I'm done now. I need to get back and stimulate myself. So that's kind of the drone zone. And that's just one thing to note. But the key thing is, this is really where am I, is are we sitting in the thriving zone, which is the green zone? And you and I often talk about the green zone, where the performance, and as you can see, as the stress level goes up, so does our performance. And so ideally, we want to play our game of life, whether it's professionally or personally, in this thriving green zone. And as you can see, when we get to a certain level of stress, and everybody's stress points are going to be different. Yours are going to be different. Mine are going to be different. So some people you might have worked with where you think, my earth, that is huge stress and they seem so calm. Some people you work with and they kind of buckle quite early. And there's a lot of multifactorial reasons for the reason we manage different stress levels, and we can maybe do that another time. But as you can see, as your stress goes up, the performance goes up, and you get this threshold of learning. So ideally, this is the productive range of stress. And what I mean by that is you've got enough stress in the system that you're now honing in, those moments when you're absolutely in flow, the work's going, you're feeling challenged, you're kind of nailing the work you're doing. That's that productive range of stress where your prefrontal cortex executive functions are online, and you are just kind of in the groove. And we all have this peak performance at a certain level of stress on the x-axis. So your peak performance and my peak performance and everyone else's peak performance will vary depending on genetics, lived experience, a whole multitude of factors. But ideally, we want to try be optimal at that peak performance. We can't stay there all the time. So as long as we're gravitating in this thriving and resting, what we have to be careful of is going into this fatigue zone and starting to slide down this part of the curve, which is now the unproductive range of stress. Now, some of your viewers will be going, well, it's all very nice, Leanne, to stay in thriving. Of course, I'd love thriving, but I operate here. Well, it's first of all awareness that you do. But my question would then be, what are you doing to get yourself back to green as much as you can during the course of the day? Because if you don't replenish, so say it's like filling a car and say, I'm going to ride 2,000 Ks on this car. I can tell you now, you're not going to get anywhere near that. And then when you get to your 600 max and the petrol's gone, it's like getting in the driver's seat and going, come on, drive. Like there's no fuel in the tank. And the same thing goes with us, our physiology. We have to fill our energy tanks up. And what you don't want, and what my personal experience was, I got into this fatigue zone. I didn't listen to the early flags, because the further along you are, the harder it is to get back to thriving. And I ignored it. I'll be fine. I'll be fine. I've always been fine. And before you know it, the fatigue becomes ill health. And then you start getting sick. Instead of being away for a cold for a day or two, you're gone for 2 weeks. And then eventually it's going to go into burnout, where you then have a very high risk, a much higher risk of mental illness. And I think, to your point, the whole thing about this is, how am I? And there's a wonderful tool that the Canadian Mental Association has put out, where they ask 5 key questions. And if you answer, and I can send it as a resource and you can share it with your viewers.
Thank you. Yeah.
But often people will go, well, how do I know if I'm in thriving or in surviving or distress? I don't know. I just feel terrible. And so this is almost a diagnostic way, this tool of going for each of the categories. One looks at sleep, how you're sleeping, your mood, how effective are you at work, how connected are you to the people around you? And I mean, it's very kind of 101. It's not obviously a validated tool, but it at least can give you an idea of, okay, I'm green here, but boy, I've got a lot of yellow coming up. That should be the trigger to go, what do I need to do? Replenish to get myself back into green. And what happens in my experience, and a lot in the caretaker arena, is we so busy focused on everybody else that we slip down the slide. It becomes a slippery slope. And before we look around, we can't get out of bed, or we're crying our way on the way to work because we're thinking we can't do this. Or we literally are not able, we're withdrawing from all the connections around us that we should seek support, because we absolutely in survival mode. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, thank you. There were 2 books that you mentioned to me which really struck home, and one was called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Yeah, by Robert Zapolsky.
And the other one was The Third Space, and learning to create the discipline of recognizing it. But I guess, yeah, if you're a really switched on leader or a switched on HR manager, you would spot when someone's going into the orange-red zone. And I guess it's personal responsibility, and it's the company's responsibility to look at that.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about a leader to spot it, so say, for example, you've got a practice as a vet, you've got to make the time to connect with your staff, because, first of all, you've got to know what to look for. But if you coming from a base of orange or red zone, and you in survival or burnout, I can tell you there is no energy in the tank available to look after other people. Because you are so fatigued that at a primitive level, you go into survival mode, which is withdraw and isolate. And I don't know, for your listeners and viewers, how many times when that stress is on, you become quite cranky and impatient with other people. That's a primitive response of survival. And so if we aren't, as leaders, taking responsibility to say, I'm running a practice, I've got 5 staff under me that are also under pressure, and I have a responsibility to make sure I've got an environment that, first of all, I'm making time to connect with them and having the conversation. It's not about, hey, how are you going? Fine, tick. It's about, hey, let's have a cup of tea together, or whatever it may be, 5 minutes at the water bubbler. And, you know, because some people go, Leanne, I don't have 2 minutes in the day. Well, it's prioritizing. And even if it's 2 minutes going, you know, how are you? You know, is there any way I can support you? You know, how's the work going? Are you keeping on top of things? So those open-ended, inquiring, curious questions, maybe your staff in the beginning won't say anything, but over time they may feel safer. But I can promise you, and I don't know your experience, but I've worked for a boss that was totally stressed out, totally cranky. There was no way that was safe for me to go, hey, I just want to have a chat. I need support. So as a leader, we have a huge responsibility. Is it easy? No, it's bloody hard, because we've got to take that personal responsibility. And yes, of course, each of your members of your team need to take their individual responsibility. But even if on a Monday you have a team meeting for the week, even doing the first check-in, guys want to check, show them the graph. Here's orange, here's green, here's red. Where are you sitting? And hey, if you're in orange and red, what are you going to do about it to try and, you know, get some energy in the tank? So suddenly it becomes a okay conversation, and people in the team feel they've got permission to go, actually, you know, Dr. Larry, I'm feeling a bit orange at the moment. Okay, what do you need from me? How can I support you? And what are you going to do? And take responsibility as well. Yeah,
I love the idea of I know for tough love, when they make you walk into the room, you pretend you're okay. So you put a green sticker on, but inside, so there's a certain amount of honesty with self that starts to play. And I guess denial of that there's anything wrong is a kind of perfectionist strategy.
Yeah.
You don't want to admit that there's something going wrong.
Totally.
So.
I mean, if I think about it, before my big burnout, I spent about 3 months wearing the 6-ton armor. I mean, I remember being asked to do a panel at a leadership, Women in Leadership Week. And I was really struggling. On the surface, let me tell you, I looked like a swan. And underneath, it was bad. And I remember in this forum of women, I mean, there must have been 100 women in the room, one of my leadership team, who I know well, I work with every day, put up her hand, and she said, I just want to know from you, Leanne, how do you manage? Because boy, you've got that balance right. And it was in that moment that I realized how fake I was being. and you know, my kids call it fugazi, because I had this facade. I'd cry on my way to work. In the car park, I'm doing the makeup, thank God for Revlon. And then I'd walk into the office, morning. So all my team ever saw was this upbeat, energetic leader. Now, if they were struggling, do you think they were going to feel safe to come to me? Because, wow, if Leanne can manage it and I can't, maybe I'm not good enough. Whereas that was my epiphany in that moment. I thought, here is someone on my leadership team who works with me every day, who is totally being conned by my facade of everything's cool, I'm managing. And when I came back from my burnout and took on that leadership position again, and I was very open about, guys, I'm going to share what happened to me, and I'm going to be very vulnerable, and I'm going to step into, this is how I'm feeling. This is what I'm doing to support myself and energize myself. I also want to check in. Was the first time my team said, wow, you're human. Suddenly we were having this wonderful conversation about, actually, I'm also struggling this week. Okay, how can we do this together? Whereas before, I thought being strong would create this wonderful, strong environment, but actually it created a totally disempowered environment. And part of me, I mean, I grew up the stoic South African, get on with it, wear the big girl pants. It was very vulnerable to admit that I wasn't actually managing. And that took me a long time, because I grew up in a context where vulnerability was weakness. In fact, vulnerability is courageous, because if you can step in and go, guys, this is a big week, there's a lot we've got to do, I'm feeling it. You open up a wonderful conversation versus get on with it and disconnecting. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think there's a wonderful statement by Shari Leviton. I think she's a also a leadership coach talking about empathy is the doorway to connection. And so if you don't show that empathetic, vulnerable side, you're not going to connect on any deep level. So
absolutely. And, you know, talking, I think you mentioned Brené Brown earlier on. I just love her in that she's got a huge amount of research on shame and vulnerability. And she's a researcher, you know, her findings are very data driven. She's an incredible storyteller. So, you know, if there's someone, you know, you're wanting to be inspired by, she's certainly someone I listen to regularly. And, you know, she was just talking about, you know, how we, you know, this whole vulnerability space, and that we, you know, at the end of the day, you know, talking about, everyone thinks that humans, we thinking machines that have a bit of emotion, or thinking beings. We actually emotional beings that think a little bit, isn't it? I mean, we emotional beings that think a little bit. So if we're not connecting, and we're wired to connect, but under stress, most, if you look at the data, 80% of people, when they are stressed, they withdraw. Whereas in fact, what we should be doing is reaching out to our safe team, the people that we know have got our back, to go, bloody hell, I had a hideous day. I just want to have a chat. I just need to download. And especially if you look at mental health with men, men find it, and the data shows women are, you know, more tribal, they more, let's have a cup of tea and chat, and they're more vocal. And again, I'm generalizing terribly here, but in general, men hold it. And that is why the mental health, that fallout is so much more prevalent in men, because I can't share. I mean, I'm a man, I've got to hold it all together. Who said so? I mean, you know, we in a tribe for a reason. We've got connections for a reason. Who said that we have to be these stoic? I mean, it's a societal construct that suddenly we've got to wear this armor and we can't be vulnerable. And I think that's where men struggle a lot, in my experience, in workshops I run. If you look at the data, is this feeling that they can't be vulnerable, that they can't go, wow, I'm struggling because I've got to be the guy. What's your experience in that?
Well, there's a global trend now. There's feminization of the profession. So before it used to be male dominated. Now it's kind of, I think it's almost 50-50.
Yeah.
Probably more female. So there's that side of it. But there's also the emotional piece. We are emotional humans, as you say, beings. And yet we're faced with business, which demands results. So there's this beautiful emotional piece within the vet industry, contrasted against money, decisions, results. They call them KPIs.
Yeah.
And I think somewhere there needs to be key behavioral indicators, so that we are sensitive to where people sit on that scale that you say. We need to have mechanisms of being compassionate with each other, and understanding that when you get out of that, you need to be cared for, just like we care for our patients.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, are there specific tools you could think of now? Don't expect a direct answer, maybe you have, but something which veterinary hospitals could perhaps use as an indicator. You mentioned that
that how are you tool.
That I'd love to see that. Is there any other tool that we can use which allows that vulnerability without judgment, that can be used for veterinary teams?
You know, my thought on that, and I'm just going to look for that tool so that I might just show you the tool, because I'll make this available. It is obviously, you know, it's sourced from so it's my version of the Canadian Mental Association. And what they did initially, just as an FYI, is they got this for their paramedics. So there was originally a drive. The paramedics were hugely under stress. They didn't know how to articulate it, or to know where they were on that curve. And so they developed this tool, and it's you know, used in a lot more context now. But these are the 5 questions. So this could be one tool that vets could use. First of all, it's about having the conversation. And as a team. So let's look at individually. And again, there are 5 questions along this margin: mood, sleep, body, social, work. And then here's the continuum of mental wellness. There's a continuum, as we all know. We sometimes in thriving, depending on the stressor with COVID, maybe what's your week's looking like. You can go into a bit of surviving. But again, it's all a lot, we move, and I think your listeners and viewers will appreciate that. And then it's looking at each one. So if you look at question number 1, mood, am I having normal fluctuations in mood, frequent positive emotions? Or am I nervous and irritable and sad? Or am I maybe frequent anxiety, anger, worsening sadness, or persistent and excessive anxiety? So you'd look at all of these mood call-outs and you'd go, actually, I'm a bit nervous and irritable at the moment. The second, you might look at sleep and do the same. And so what you might have is circles around surviving. You might have sleep is still thriving. From a body wellness, you're thriving, but maybe you've started to decrease your engagement with others and your social activity. So what happens is then okay, 3 out of the 5 are thriving, but 2 are surviving. That should be already a flag individually. I need to do something and reassess what I'm doing to fill my energy tanks. Does that make sense?
I'm smiling because some of the hospitals that I've been in, I think when the owner comes in, everyone's going to be wearing a red badge. So I think to catch yourself before you get there is the trick.
Correct. And so that's a diagnostic way to give you. So the first thing is looking at it from an individual point of view. So how am I? And then if you do that exercise, and really, my recommendation always is to people, we at different parts on the continuum. So I do workshops with 100 people where 10 of them go, I'm nailing this self-care thing. I'm prioritizing myself first. And I go, there are going to be a whole lot of you in the room. Some of you are going to go, I know the stuff. So, hey, use this as a refresher. Some of you are going to be on the other end where you are really feeling burnt out. And so the important thing is for those of you who are nailing it, maybe do this how am I exercise with that tool of 5 questions, maybe once a month, just to make sure you're keeping on top of your self-care, and it should be all green. For those of you who are burnt out, my recommendation is do it once a week. So maybe on a Sunday night going into a week, or on a Monday morning, getting an idea of where you're at. And therefore that would, we make diagnoses all the time as mental and veterinary professionals. We're saying to our patients, this is what's wrong with you, and therefore this is what you need to do. So it's kind of taking those learnings and going, okay, I've got a bit of orange here. It's Monday or Sunday night. I'd recommend Sunday night, because then you can make sure that you walk into Monday having had a good sleep, a good brekkie, maybe a short little walk in the morning, and your energy tanks are filled. And maybe if you're really struggling, do it once. I've had, people come to me and said, I did it on a daily basis initially. It took me a minute. I did it on a daily basis, and just that awareness brought it front of mind. So when I felt fatigued during the day, I forced myself to get up away from my desk or to go and eat lunch outside. And then, of course, they're the 2 ends of the extreme, and then there's everybody in between. But if you're sitting there and listening to this and going, wow, I do feel fatigued. I think I play the game of my life most of the time in yellow. I'd recommend once a week, do the how am I? Then you go, okay, where am I on the, am I in surviving in the yellow or the green? Now, green, you have to maintain it. Green doesn't mean you're off the hook. So whatever you're doing, carry on doing. And often when there's more pressure in the system, we can tend to drop our self-care. For the yellow, there's some more deliberate things you need to do. So it might be as little as making sure you're getting good, consistent sleep. So you're going to bed at the same time every night and you're waking up at the same time every morning with a 15-minute window. That is the biggest bang for your buck in terms of getting good quality sleep. It is much better in terms, if you look at the research, than getting hours of sleep. So if they compared consistency duration, you get much, because you actually then your brain gets into the cycle of, it knows when you're going to go to sleep, it knows when you're going to go to wake up, and it's able to produce the hormones in preparation versus if you're all over the place. Going into a busy week, what are you eating? What nutrition are you having in the morning before you go to the practice? Are you just going via the drive-through and getting processed food? Well, that is hugely energy expensive, and your brain will prioritize digestion over being able to think properly. So how often do we eat that big Macca's burger and you feel a bit foggy? Because your brain's prioritizing it. Even moving, and it doesn't mean you have to go and run 10 Ks, just getting out and walking around your garden. I mean, depending on your context and where you live, I sometimes just do my block. And then I make this transition of, okay, now I've got some movement, because movement we know burns cortisol, which is our major stress hormone. You've slept well, so that means you mentally, physically, emotionally at a good fitness level. Plus, you fueled your body with good nutrition. Hydration's key. So you keep a water bottle close, 25 mils of water per kilo per day is what they recommend. Unless you're exercising and doing a lot of sweating, then you obviously need more water. Those are 101s of filling our energy tank. And then movement, if you look at veterinary, I'd make the assumption you're up all the time, you're moving. So you're getting that movement during your day, which is actually really positive, because there are a lot of jobs that you sit behind a desk all day. So by virtue of the jobs, that incidental movement is actually hugely important. So you're already, as vets, ticking a lot of boxes by virtue of the clinical environment. But it's then making time that maybe at lunchtime, even if it's 15 minutes, getting out of the practice, standing in the garden. And again, it depends on where your practice is and the ability to do this. But I'm going to take my lunch and I'm going to go and sit with a mate and connect and eat and just try and not think of work and fill my physical, emotional, mental energy tank. And, the one thing, and I know we're coming to the end of this particular session together, is the third space. And I've talked to you about that is a wonderful way throughout the day, no matter how busy your day is to fill your emotional, mental, and physical energy tanks. Do you want me to go through the third space just quickly?
That would be great. There's so much to cover here. We're going to have to break it in pieces.
No, that's all cool. That's all cool.
But one thing I'd also like to cover once we've done that is once you've followed the strategy, the 101 strategy, you've followed the discipline. Do you think because of the personalities which are selected to become veterinarians are primed and predisposed in other ways other than these physiologic triggers that you're talking about?
So your question is whether personality traits have an impact on how we manage stress?
Yes.
Is that your question?
Because I know most veterinarians from quite a lot of work in the UK is that we're all CS energy. So we're detailed. We love the caring, compassion. So there's a lot of S energy in there. So quick decision making, having fun are kind of low on the list. I'm not saying all veterinarians, but generally, in all likelihood, veterinarians are more on the CS energy side.
Yeah. So if you look at it in that framework of the C and the S energy, and that's not necessarily, I'm familiar with the framework. I don't utilize it too much, but I think the energy kind of frameworks I use complement it quite nicely. So if the C energy is very detail focused, that's very mentally draining, because you're going to need to get into deep focused tasks, and you're going to that need for executive function, the quick decision making, particularly in emergency situations, or if you're doing surgery or whatever, you need to make sure your prefrontal cortex is online. So if you're doing that kind of intensive work, we know even though the brain's only 3 to 4 kilos of our body weight, it requires 30% of our daily energy.
Sure.
So if you're spending and doing 10 hours of client-based work, you are literally draining your mental energy tank without a shadow of a doubt. Now, if you're not replenishing during the day, then the next day, you're going to get to rock bottom where you're going to start. And I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where you're doing something going, like, I know how to do this, but I just can't even think. Like someone asks you a question and like you go, I do know the answer, but sorry, it's almost like your inner voice goes, I can't access it. Some people describe it as a foggy brain. That means that you are mentally energy depleted. So the kind of work that doctors do, that veterinarians do in that, high intensity mental executive requirement is hugely energy draining. So even more important to watch your energy. And then also that emotional component, because we've got a physical energy tank, we've got a mental energy tank, we've got an emotional energy tank. Now, if you're doing all that emotional work, it's all energy giving the whole day. So if you're not doing things like connecting with others, which is a prime way to fill your emotional energy tank, you are going to slowly deplete that tank as well. So, in those energies that you mentioned, both of them would be incredibly fatiguing from an energy perspective if you were not deliberately topping them up during the day. Does that make sense?
No, it does. I come home from work sometimes and I have no words left, but it's just
I know. I remember I used to come home from work and the kids, when they were little in primary school, first of all, they'd look at me at the door. And if I looked like a deer in headlights, they'd disappear to their rooms because they'd go, Mom, and I'd head to the wine fridge. And let me tell you, my husband said, I remember at the time, my husband said, darling, I think you should have a personal KPI. You've got a personal KPI. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I know how your day's been if you get to the front door and you go straight to the wine fridge without saying hello to anybody, I know it's been a terrible day. If you stop and go, hey, kids, how was your day? And then you get to the wine fridge, then I can judge based on, that's my KPI for you, which I thought was quite funny.
Have you ever had sessions where you have the professional and the spouse in the same room because they know? So if you don't have that supportive environment, that also adds to a really stressful piece of the mix.
And that, talks to something we were talking about individual, how am I? But also to your point that you've just raised now is my question would be, how often do you as a business owner or you as working in an organization or whatever your context is, if you have a team that you work with, how often do you sit down and have a conversation about, and part of my workshop is, how do you show up when you're stressed? What's your first flag that and everyone's different. Some people get cranky. Some people physically feel a bit sick. Some people go foggy. And often I ask the question, how would your workmates know that you're stressed? And people know.
They know.
How people see them. And then I ask the third question, how would your family know that you're stressed? Because often we take the ugly part, or it was certainly my experience, the ugliest part of me in burnout went home because it was a career limiting move to bring it to work. And so
you described the swan.
Yes, the leftovers in the silver swan. Remember in the old days where the silver swan, and I kind of realized I'm taking all the good stuff of me to work, and my family are left with the leftovers. So it's also having those conversations with your team, like, hey guys, let's just be open. When I'm stressed, this is how I show up. I get cranky, and they might all nod and go, yes, you do, we know. But it's also good to know how your team show up. So what's the first thing? Oh no, I kind of withdraw. I stop talking. I feel quite sick. And so that helps you as a leader go, you're starting to calibrate your team. And if you notice some shifts and you're already aware that that's how they shift when they're stressed, it opens the conversation. Hey, I noticed that you more quiet today. I know that's one of the things that you shared with me you do when you're stressed. I just want to check in how you're going. So it's having those conversations that are very open, that people can even use humor. Wow, Larry, okay, you get a bit cranky today, buddy. And sometimes that humor can release that stress in the system, but your team gets to know you, you get to know them, and that's huge.
Do you want to go through those levels that you were chatting about?
Sure. So this is just a third space, and I'll give you a little bit of context.
Yeah.
It's a very accessible book. Adam Fraser is a colleague of mine. He wrote it back in 2015. And he originally started with sportsmen, professional sports people. And he said he wanted to figure out why, in the heat of the moment, at that last shot that's going to win the game, why some people were chocolate firemen and collapsed and lost, and why some people won the game. And so he started talking to these professionals, going, what's going on in your head that allows you to hit that final shot and win the game versus fall apart? And what he then realized is that there's the space, that the third space framework was born out of these conversations. And he then took it to the business world and applied it amongst executives and workers in business at leadership levels. And he showed that if you implement the third space tools, within 6 weeks of doing it, there was a 30% increase in overall mood. So that emotional, mental fitness benefit was enormous. And so this is what it involves. And I may give the context of, how about in your veterinary space, client to client, where you've got one client coming in and you've got back-to-back client sessions, consults, for example. So exactly. So let's say space one is work or a meeting or seeing a client. I mean, use your context. Space two is maybe the next client that's on, that's been booked in. The third space is the space in between. And so what he showed that, and he divided this into 3 sections. The first part was, most of us, when we've had a client that maybe has been cranky or very angry with what we've, had to tell them, or the news we've delivered, as humans, what we do is we often, and I'm going to stop sharing, what we focus on are all the negatives. We don't focus on the good stuff that just happened in the consult. We focus on, oh, they were so pissed off with us. I maybe got that diagnosis. It wasn't quite, or whatever it may be. We focus on where we failed. And what Adam Fraser showed is that these elite sportsmen, they don't focus on the negative. The first port of call in that third space, and I'm just going to pop my glasses on because I needed to see, that first port of call is reflect on how do I interpret what just happened to me in that consult, but what went well. So instead of focusing on all, it could be I was super professional and I really helped that client understand what's happening with their pet. And again,
remedy for all perfectionists, this one.
Correct. And again, I'm making up the context, and I apologize.
That's perfect. It's here.
I'm not. So again, how do I interpret just what happened, and what went well, and what story do I tell myself? Because most of the time we will go, God, that was a terrible consult. I can't believe I missed that. What an idiot. Seriously, is that the best? And we literally self-deprecate, and that inner voice becomes that massive inner critic, which is negatively draining of energy at every level. So the first part of the third space is reflecting what went well. Wow, I'm really, and maybe for graduate vets that are watching this, or newer in the as you're growing and you're learning on the job, wow, I'm really pleased I was super professional. And I've learned more about this procedure, and wow, I'm starting to build my skill set. That would be the reflect. Then it would be a rest part of the third space. Can I still be present and not be distracted by the consult I've just had? How do I relax? And there are a number of ways you can do that. And I'll show you them in a second. And then before you walk into the next consult room, is there's this reset phase. How am I going to show up when I meet my next client with their pet? Am I going to have all that? Normally we'd take all the baggage from the one consult and how horrible we feel about ourselves, and we'll dump it into the next consult. Instead, the third space enables you to intentionally go, I'm going to show up as the vet that I am, 100% for the client in a positive space, and I'm there to serve. So that could be a set, what is my intention and what is the behavior? I'm going to be compassionate, empathetic, and I'm going to have some fun. I'm going to bring some fun into the room. And so, you know, people might be watching this and going, there's no way between consults I can do all of this. If you practice, it's like building a muscle. But let's say you've got 60 seconds between one consult and the other, worst case scenario. I mean, if you can try and build in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, it would be ideal for consults, between consults. But say we've got a minute. You reflect 20 seconds. How did that consult go? Look, I felt really proud of the fact that I got that diagnosis right. The client was really happy, and I felt really good that they felt empowered because the diagnosis made them feel less anxious. I feel good about that. Great job, because we don't often pat ourselves on the back. Reset could simply be 20 seconds of slow resonant breathing, box breathing, 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds, out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds. The special forces use it before going into combat. So as you're walking from one consult room to the other, just 2 sets of box breathing. That's going to rest your stress response. And then as you see the door you're going to walk into, that 20 seconds or 10 seconds, how am I going to show up is the vet that I know I can be, compassionate, empathetic, and 100% engaged for this client, and you walk in the door. And the impact of that, it fills every energy tank. It fills the physical, emotional, mental energy tank. And even if that's the only strategy you try initially to top up your energy during the day, you will be topping it up by little bits throughout the day. If you think you've got maybe 20 consults, that's 20 opportunities to top up.
It's amazing, because I think right now there's such a shortage of veterinary staff across the whole industry, and so the pressure is still there. And when you try and introduce the 4-day week concept, the owners are really scared of that one, because they just can't understand that the team is actually very functional for those 4 days because they're rested for 3. So the companies that have done really well are paying people the same amount of money, but giving them the time to recover. Exactly. And if you don't recover, then this, to me, the third space would be the step before you do that. So it's really been interesting moving from South Africa through Australia and now to New Zealand to watch the different cultures and how people approach stress. So, Leanne, I just want to thank you so much. There's so much in here. We can unpack it in segments, but wonderful to chat to you again. And we will reconnect, and I hope that the viewers that are watching this or listening have got something out of it. So I have no doubt we'll be chatting again.
Yeah, no, and Larry, if I could just say before we close, again, thank you for the opportunity. I hope, everyone's taken something, whether it's an aha moment of, wow, I live in orange. Whether it's a, how am I? And I'll send you that toolkit of, wow, I've got to focus on my sleep. So it might be an aha moment, but if I can really invite everyone who's listening and watching is to pick one thing. Because if you decide, okay, our A-type personalities, I'm going to take 10 things on, I'm going to try the third space, I'm going to try the tool. We often don't, we fail. And this is certainly my experience from doing these workshops and working with people one-on-one. So even if you just pick one thing and go, the one thing I'm going to do this week is I'm going to focus on my sleep consistency. That's it. And start slowly. And as you're feeling better and your emotional, physical, and mental fitness gets better, you're then going to be open to taking on a second thing or a third thing. So my invitation, and even the comments on the bottom of this podcast, if there is an opportunity, is perhaps as a, commit what is the one thing you commit to today that you are going to try? And some days you're going to get it right and some days you're not, and that is okay. But just focus on one thing. Maybe it is when I get home, I'm going to set the intention. I'm going to be that partner, sibling, friend, pet owner that is going to be 100% there and available, and they're going to get the best of me. Maybe that's all you focus on. But the invitation is find one thing and just get started.
Yeah. Well, there are certainly lots of things to choose from. Yeah. So I hope each person listening picks one. Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure, Larry. Pleasure.